Hi, welcome back, everybody. I'm here again with Karen White of Divine Time Astrology, divinetimeastrology.com. We've been going through all the planets and how they relate to relationships. So by understanding how planets situate within your chart, that'll give you insights into how that's going to impact your capacity for relationship. And today, we're at the final planet, I believe so. Yeah, Saturn.
Saturn.
And we're going to consider all the things that Saturn represents that either hurt our capacity for a relationship or help us in a relationship. And also we're going to talk about ways to work with that Saturn if you have difficulties so that you can improve yourself within and through a relationship. So welcome back, Karen. It's good to see you again.
Yeah, you too, Ryan.
So we're going to be talking about Saturn. And when we think about Saturn, what comes to my mind is this idea that he is the planet of hardships and delays and burdens and death and all these painful things. And most of the time, people don't really think about Saturn in regards to relationships. So how do we take all of that and how do we see the validity of the indications of Saturn within the realm of life for relationships?
Well, I look at Saturn in a chart to see if it's strong.
Mm-hmm.
And there's a lot of different ways it can be strong, depending on where it is, the sign that it's in, if he's being helped by his friends,
right,
or if he has enemies. And the stronger Saturn is in a person's birth chart, in the regular birth chart and in the Navamsha,
right,
then the more I know they can handle pain, mm-hmm. especially the kind of pain that's outside their control, like the economy, sickness, death, stuff like that, taxes, who gets elected,
yeah.
All these things are outside of our control.
Right.
But if Saturn is weak, then I know that there's going to be some problems that will have an impact on their relationships. So if Saturn is weak, like for instance in Aries, then I know the person has a harder time maintaining focus over a long period of time. Mm-hmm. They tend to give up easily. Interestingly enough, and it's because Saturn and Mars they're enemies. They're very different forces, even though in some ways they're a pair, mm-hmm. because they're the two survival planets. I also look to see if Saturn is really weak, then I know they give up easily, they can't handle pain very well, and they'll be difficult to be with in a relationship because they may tend to complain a lot. Mm-hmm. And or be upset about things that they can't do anything about. And so I tell them this, mm-hmm. And they're always like, yeah, that's true. I am like that. And so then there are things that you can do to help your Saturn. Mm-hmm. Life, just living over time as you get older, you kind of learn how to deal with it just because you have to, unless you're just one of those people who never get a clue. And even as an old person, you're cranky and you're angry about everything, and you feel like life has been really unfair. Nevertheless, so that means nobody's going to want to be around you.
Right.
No one, mm-hmm. because you're a drag, basically, to be around. So, would you want to say something about that?
Well, that is a hard place to be in, because when you're a drag to be around. And someone tells you you're not in relationships because you're a drag to be around. that's difficult, because usually the person doesn't know how to not be a drag.
Yeah.
Right. And so, one of the things that I've noticed, I've got Saturn on my ascendant. So I can relate to that. And it makes a person prone to things like depression, or it makes a person prone to just seeing the problems in life. And, I can remember many a time when I would be, working with people or listening to the news or something, and I would just say to my wife, no matter how positive I try to be, the world just always lets me down. It's like it doesn't ever work. So what I found is when those kinds of things come up, in order to not be such a drag and to be a little more enjoyable in relationships, I had to force myself to like go out and play music, or I had to force myself to call up some of my friends and say, hey, let's go play darts and have a couple beers, just to get me out of that, space,
Yeah.
and to enjoy myself. So what I would say is, when you have difficulty with Saturn and people have told you you're a drag, or your astrologer says you're terrible, you're a terrible, horrible person to be around. That's why.
I would never say that.
Oh, okay. I remember that. I remember that reading you did for me, and you said that. Yeah. But if they say that, or you know that about yourself, part of the things that I think people have to do is they have to find a way to force themselves to do something fun. And they just have to force themselves to do it, you know. And the other thing about Saturn is the ability to bear burdens. And relationship is a burden. I mean, if you have in your head that it's going to be easy, that it's never going to, there's not going to ever be compromise. If you have all these weird ideas in your head, then you get in a relationship, and the moment your partner doesn't agree with you, or you have a discrepancy in about how you want to raise your kid or invest money, or they do something that lets you down, or you see the dark side of them. Well, everyone's got that. Everyone's got a problem, the dark side in that regard.
Yeah.
Well, and Saturn's got that difficulty with it, bad dignity in a difficult house. The person can't bear that burden. And so, like, you use the term focus. But I think I would say they lack the focus to stay the path, but they also lack the ability to say, this is hard, but it's going to pass. Where this person has a problem, and I love them anyway, and that's just being human.
Yeah. Right.
So, you know, what I would say is that you really have to be cautious of Saturn in your chart, because the worse dignity that it's in, the more it's starved by Mars or even the moon or the sun, the more likely you're going to see the problems and not persevere through them. You're going to look at life. You're going to see 10 problems over here and 20 good things over here. And if you've got Saturn and bad dignity, all you see is those 10 bad things. You don't even pay attention to the good.
Saturn looks down.
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
So, you know, that would be one of the main things I would say, is that when we're thinking about Saturn relationships, is when it's good, that can give a great longevity to relationships, because the person understands that life is hard.
Yeah.
That your spouse is going to make mistakes. You're going to make mistakes. But at the end of the day, it's that you made it through it, not that it was perfect the whole way.
Yes.
Right?
And also, when Saturn is strong too, you're more accepting of flaws in the other person. And the fact that they're going to get older, you know, they're not going to look the same as they did when you first met them.
Exactly.
They may get sick, and eventually they're going to die. One of you is probably going to die before the other. And that's okay, because none of us get out of here alive, as they say.
Right.
But, you know, I have Saturn ruling my ascendant. It's not in the ascendant. I have it in the 12th. And when I was in my Saturn period, I did struggle with depression also.
Right.
And so now, even now, I can recognize certain thoughts that come. And when because of that, because I've been through depression before. And so now when I have certain kinds of thoughts, I argue with those thoughts. I don't automatically believe them.
Exactly.
And what helps the most with depression actually is cognitive therapy, which is changing the way you think. And because Saturn, he looks down, he tends to be about fears. He tends to be about, well, like for instance, if a person has a Sasa Yoga, which is where Saturn is in its own sign or exaltation sign in an angle, then this person is very fear-based. And but there are good things about it, though, too. It means they're capable of perseverance. They'll keep going and going and going. They show up all the time. They're very dutiful. Oh, that's right. Saturn's about duty.
Right.
And he will do his duty no matter what. And so this really helps in marriage because there's going to be ups and downs and ebbs and flows, and there are going to be times where you're going to feel really far away from your partner, and you're going to wonder, you know, if it's worth being in anymore. And it's just an ebb, you know. You're just the tide went out. It's going to come back, and during that time, you know, you do your duty as a partner, because each person in the relationship has a duty.
Mm-hmm.
And which is one of the reasons why I recommend Dr. Patricia Allen's book, Getting to I Do, in spite of its cheesy title, because it explains so clearly and in detail, in concrete terms, what does the feminine energy person bring? Basically, what's the responsibility, and the masculine energy. And when you see what that is, then you know what you're supposed to do.
Right.
And when it's hard, you just keep doing those things.
Mm-hmm.
You know, the husband doesn't say, well, you know what, I feel really far away from you now, and I don't think I like you very much, and you know, life is hard. He doesn't like stop going to work, and he doesn't stop paying the bills. I mean, if he's got a decent Saturn, right?
Right. Yeah.
And anyway, so
well, I think those are good points, and especially, you know, when we think about Saturn in the D9 or in the Navamsha, you know, and one thing I do want to point out is that when Karen and I are talking about these planets, that we're just giving real general ideas, meaning
right.
you have to look at the whole chart. So it's not just here's Saturn in isolation, and so therefore by looking at that, we're going to be able to tell everything. You have to match it up with the whole chart. But speaking of Saturn isolation, when it comes to marriage in the D9, well, as Karen was saying, sometimes there's going to be an ebb and a flow to relationships, meaning sometimes you're going to be together and doing things and thinking, this is just great. You know, we've gone on a picnic every Saturday over the summer, and it's just, life is beautiful. And sometimes it'll be winter, and you'll say, gee, I haven't seen my spouse in like 6 months because he or she's been working a lot and I feel so distant.
Yeah.
But the thing that Saturn does in the D9 is it gives you a capacity to be alone, so that you don't have to always be connected. You have the capacity to have breathing room, in a sense. And the other thing about Saturn and the D9 is that it gives us the capacity to survive the troubles of marriage. You know, because some people, they'll have children and something will happen to one of their child, and that heavy burden just breaks up the marriage. Some people, it brings them together. Some people, it's because of debt. Some people, it's because of infidelity. Some people, it's because of just the partner's a total idiot, you know, whatever it may be. But at the end of the day, if that Saturn is strong and everything else is equal, the marriage can survive through all those difficulties, all those troubles, all those tribulations. And that's when you get to the end of one's life, and the couple looks back and say, wow, remember all that stupid stuff you did, or remember all those bad things that happened, but remember all the good times too. And they look at their life as just like a story, and that you have ups and downs in the chapters, but at the end, that's what makes it worthwhile. And that's what makes it enriching for you, you know, as a soul. Right. So, you know, I think one thing, and I want to hear what you have to say about that. With Saturn and the D9, it's very important, because I found that it allows a person to stay committed, to have their duty that they enact in the marriage, but they're also realizing that it's not always going to be perfect. And they're okay with that. They realize that that's just a natural part of life, right?
Yes. I mean, when you talked about how before, when you got depressed, you would force yourself to go out and go do something fun. Mm-hmm. What you did was you went to Venus. Mm-hmm. You know?
Exactly.
And Venus is a friend to Saturn. So you can, if your Saturn is weak or he's in a position, he can sometimes be too strong. Right. Like I was saying, you know, the Sasa Yoga. And when that happens, your partner may say things to you about how controlling you are.
Right.
So if you've ever been accused of being controlling, or been with somebody who was controlling, what you can know is that it's because Saturn he's getting outside of his boundaries. He's getting involved in things that...
Well, he's afraid, and he's trying to manage.
Afraid. Yeah, it's about fear. It's all about fear. Being controlling is about fear. Mm-hmm. And so the antidote to that is Venus, basically. And it can be the sun, too, because the sun is about purpose. And it's about something higher, because the sun looks up, right? And Saturn looks down. And so if you're having these kinds of problems in your relationship, then you can know that you're probably looking down too much and you're being fearful of something. And all you have to do is follow your thoughts, and you'll find it. Mm-hmm. It'll pop up. All you have to do is just look, right. And it's there. And then you work with that fear and confront it, and don't automatically believe it when you're thinking it, especially if you have Saturn with or aspecting the moon. So this is one of the things that, like for women in general, one of the things that men tend to not really like at all in a woman is if she looks down too much. Mm-hmm. If she tends to see the negative side of everything and to be very fearful. It can be kind of it can cause your partner to feel despair, really.
Right, yeah.
Because it's so difficult to make you happy. It's so difficult to be around you because you tend to point out everything that's wrong.
Right, exactly.
And these things are not there because they really are. Of course, there's a lot of bad things. But if you notice what it is you pay attention to, that's the thing that tends to grow.
Right.
And there's always a better way of looking at something. There's an empowering way to look at it and a disempowering way to look at it. Saturn tends to be kind of the disempowering way to look at it.
Yeah.
This is why cognitive therapy is the best for that kind of thing.
Well, you brought up some really interesting points there. Number one, you mentioned that by going to Venus, that can help Saturn. And something sort of on topic, but also very interesting that I found is that when it comes to gemstones, everyone recommends a blue sapphire for Saturn. Yeah. And some of you may or may not know, but Karen and I, at least I'm pretty sure Karen doesn't either, but we don't really subscribe to that way of doing gemstones where there's only 9 gemstones and they're all the most expensive gemstones that you could ever want to buy to help. But there is a gemstone specifically for Venus, and that is a blue sapphire. And so that's what I always found fascinating, is that when people had problems with Saturn, the recommendation was a blue sapphire. When really, if you break down the crystalline structure and so on of the stone, that ends up being for Venus in Gemini. Yeah. Which, again, by strengthening Venus, will help to soothe Saturn. That's always the main point, that soothing. And what's always fascinating is how opposite Saturn and Venus are in one way. Venus is the planet that deals with purpose. Mm. It's the one that they say makes a person an astrologer or a poet, which is what? They find meaning where there is none.
Right.
where you write poetry and, you read it, you think that's beautiful, that's inspiring, that's just so nourishing. But there's really no meaning to it. I mean, if you really just break it apart, the same thing with music. There's no meaning to it with dancing. There's no meaning to it. You do it for its own sake, right? Yeah. And it's beautiful. And Saturn, on the other hand, is, what's the point? Saturn goes the other way. Saturn doesn't say, let's find meaning and make meaning. Saturn says there's absolutely no meaning. So one of the ways that you can actually work with Saturn is to create your own meaning. Mm. And that's the hardest thing to do for a Saturn person. But if you can do it, then you find a real sense of richness and joy in your life. So just you mentioning all that kind of made me think about that.
Yeah.
One other thing I was curious about before we segue towards the end of our time together about Saturn is when you're working with someone and you see that, say, Saturn is in the 7th house or in the 9th house or with Venus or their AtmaKaraka or so on, but it's an okay Saturn. I mean, when you see that, how do you share with people that maybe it just means that they're going to have greater success
later,
relationships later on?
Yeah, later on. They're just a late bloomer.
Yeah. Are you able to get that through to people very easily?
Yeah, it's one of the first things I tell them when they have Saturn in areas that are delaying. Because Saturn, he rules he rules the elderly. He's the old man.
Right.
And so he represents old age and longevity in that regards. So when you have Saturn in certain places and you're wondering, okay, am I always going to be alone? Am I ever going to be in a relationship? Yeah, you will as you get older. Mm-hmm. And in fact, people who have Saturn strong in various places in their chart, they tend to actually look younger
as they get older.
Longer, yeah, as they get older, and they retain a kind of a youthfulness about them, probably because they did come to everything so late.
Right.
And there's nothing wrong with that. Just be patient and keep doing your life, working with yourself the best that you can, and it'll happen.
And patience is a Saturnine quality too.
Yeah, perseverance. Yeah, perseverance for sure.
Yeah.
It's one of the gifts of Saturn, actually. So when somebody has a Sasa Yoga, one of the first things I tell them is that they have the gift of perseverance, because they do. And they tend to be the ones who are still standing after everyone else has given up.
Right.
They're focused on something else, whatever. Saturn keeps suiting up, showing up, and therefore ends up being the winner in the end.
And that's exactly why Saturn's considered to be the planet of greatness.
Yeah.
Because,
there's a book about him too.
There is, The Greatness of Saturn. That brings me to a good point.
One of the best books ever.
One of the final things that I want to mention is that The Greatness of Saturn is a wonderful book to read to help you work with Saturn. There is a download at AstroVedicAstrology.com under the downloadable courses section. It's a free Sadhi Sati Saturn course. It's about an hour and a half, but it helps you find ways to work with Saturn, with mantra, with service, and things of this nature. So if you have problems with Saturn, in the downloadable courses section of AstroVedicAstrology.com, there's a full little mini course on it. And Karen and I have also done, as I mentioned, or she has mentioned, the AtmaKaraka course. And if you want to learn more about how Saturn influences a person as an AtmaKaraka or as a Karaka in relationships, you can find that course on our sites as well to help give you more insights on how to work with it.
I like Saturn people a lot.
Well, thank you.
My husband's a Saturn person, Saturn-Venus person. And, you can count on those people.
Right.
They really are very dependable, reliable, they're dutiful.
Yeah.
And they're consistent. They tend to be consistent. And they're humble in many ways. They're, unless it's with the sun. But that's the conversation.
And unless they're overcompensating. So
yeah, overcompensating.
All right.
Really, Saturn people are awesome. They're the salt of the earth. Seriously, they're the people who get things done. They do the work and they don't complain about it. They're not all interested in prestige and honor and et cetera all the time.
Right.
They'll do the stuff that nobody else wants to do, but that needs to be done. And if it doesn't get done, nothing great can be accomplished.
And that, that's a really great way to put it, especially in regards to relationships. Relationships are not the fireworks. Relationships are doing the little things every day to make the relationship work. And that's an important Saturn quality that, I think we could all develop in that regard. So.
Exactly.
But anyway, all right. Well, thank you very much, Karen. It was a pleasure to have you here today and doing this whole series. And again, you can find Karen at divinetimeastrology.com. She's very enjoyable to work with from what I've heard when it comes to doing relationship astrology. So again, thanks, Karen. It was great to be with you again.
You too, Ryan. Thank you.
Take care.
You too.
Bye.